The book of Daniel tells a story about three Jews who worked for the Babylonian Empire, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. King Nebuchadnezzar liked them, for they were noble and wise. He appointed them to be provincial administrators. At first, all seemed well. But then, King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue of himself, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. Nebuchadnezzar told all the people in his empire that whenever they heard music, they had to bow down and worship the statue, and anyone who refused would be burnt in a fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused. Soldiers bound their limbs and threw the three men into a raging furnace. But miraculously, they emerged unscathed, their limbs unbound, their hair unsinged, their clothing untouched, not even the smell of smoke clinging to them. What's really interesting to me is what the Talmud has to say about this story. Because the Bible mentions the disobedience of only Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, our sages infer that all of the other Jews of Babylon did comply with Nebuchadnezzar's order. That inference seems to trouble the rabbis because they offer justifications for why it was acceptable to bow before the statue. In the Talmud, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai teaches, though the Jews of Babylon bowed down to the statue, they didn't really worship it. They only pretended to do so, for appearance's sake. That's not good behavior, but it's not exactly avodah zarah, idolatry either. Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi's grandson, agreed that bowing before the statue was not really idolatry, but for a different reason. He argued that the statue was like a monument, andrata she'asa lichvod atzmo, a bust that Nebuchadnezzar made to honor himself. Therefore, bowing to the statue wasn't the same as bowing to a real idol. Maybe the Jews who bowed to Nebuchadnezzar's statue thought it was a harmless monument. Maybe they were just pretending to worship it. Or maybe they felt that the situation was ambiguous enough and they feared Nebuchadnezzar's fiery furnace enough that they figured it was better to capitulate, and if God asked questions later, they would have plausible deniability. Except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who must have thought, this crosses a line. The Babylonian king insists that we bow down to a golden statue of his likeness. That is idolatry, plain and simple. But why do the other Israelites not see it that way? Let me offer two ideas, two ways by which we lose our moral footing and courage. The first is fear. Fear is natural. There's no getting around the fact that acting courageously makes us vulnerable, since courage, by definition, requires risking something. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that was their very lives. For us, courage may mean risking embarrassment, social discomfort, or our own ego. At the extreme end, courage might entail risking our jobs or families or friends, being doxxed, harassed, imprisoned, deported, disappeared, risking our physical safety. Fear can make us contort ourselves to avoid such vulnerability. Jewish tradition understands that all-consuming fear can debilitate our moral dispositions. Al tirah, do not fear, is repeated in Torah so often that Maimonides counts it as one of the 613 mitzvot. In the book of Deuteronomy, God instructs judges, Lo taguru mipnei ish, Fear no man, for judgment is God's. Our sages explain this verse. Someone who has agreed to serve as a judge cannot be influenced by the threats of a violent litigant, nor can a judge fear offending the powerful with their ruling. As Orthodox Rabbi Yitzchak Blau writes, judges cannot cater their decisions to aristocrats or bullies. Or, in the words of former SDNY U.S. Attorney Danielle Sassoon, I have always considered it my obligation to pursue justice impartially, without favor to the wealthy or those who occupy important public office. Someone invested with authority cannot fear upsetting the violent or offending the powerful. Leaders cannot cower. Fear clouds our ability to think clearly and act on principles. Fear can lead us to abandon our core commitments. The second way people lose ethical footing is through moral fading. Moral fading is a term coined by researchers Ann Tenbrunsel and David Messick that captures how, incrementally, our sense of normal can expand to accommodate what was at one point unfathomable. Moral fading occurs in several ways. The first is haziness of language. Euphemisms allow us to obfuscate ethics. For example, bowing to a statue of a king isn't idolatry, but rather a gesture of respect for a sovereign. Or, as Tenbrunsel and Messick wrote in 2004, we engage in aggressive accounting practices, not illegal ones. There may be some externalities associated with a strategy, not harmful to others or the environment. We have collateral damage in military campaigns, not civilian deaths. In the haze of confusing language, we don't see, or we choose not to see, reality. Moral fading also occurs through distancing and externalizing control. We blame systems and minimize our own agency. I was following orders. This is how my family is. This is how the world is. What sociologist Diane Vaughan calls normalization of deviance also contributes to moral fading. If one person in a community gets away with bad behavior, others start to think, this is the cultural norm. This is the unspoken professional expectation. Everyone's doing it. I'd be at a disadvantage if I didn't. Constant exposure to unethical behavior can lead to psychological numbing and to chain reactions of more bad behavior. Through shifting language, distancing from our own agency, and the normalization of deviance, bright moral lines fade. We probably still think of ourselves as decent people, but we're judging ourselves by our intentions and not by the consequences of our actions and our inactions. So how do we resist moral fading and being consumed by our fear? How do we cling to our values and act on them courageously when it feels like the world around us is losing all of its ethical standards? How do we act like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and not like Babylon's other Israelites whose names we have forgotten? We start with conviction, deeply held values, and a vision of the good. As Nobel Peace Laureate Maria Ressa writes, if your lines are clear, so are your points of action. Knowing what we stand for has a clarifying and energizing effect. Knowing our values and our red lines ahead of time means that when a line is crossed and a value is violated, we will have the courage to act. We need to know what we stand for. Maybe it's a sense of personal dignity. Maybe it's a professional code. fiduciary duty, confidentiality, editorial independence, the right to counsel, informed consent, judicial independence, proper record keeping, freedom of the pulpit. Maybe it's a guiding national principle that we hold dear: free speech, due process, the rule of law. Or perhaps a broader ideological conviction: freedom, sustainability, fairness, love. When we really believe in something, the way the heroes of our story believed in their duty to worship God alone, courage will follow. Conviction makes us brave. Conviction pushes us to accept vulnerability, for when we truly believe in something with all our hearts and souls, we take risks for its sake. Conviction sparks courage, and practice sustains it. We develop courage by stretching ourselves daily in small, quiet ways, making the phone call we dread, speaking up for ourselves or others, interjecting when someone we care about says something bigoted. Courage is a muscle we build through the consistent practice of acting on our values. Mitzvah goreret mitzvah, Ben Azai said in Pirkei Avot. A good deed brings about another good deed. Bravery begets bravery. We ready ourselves for moments of extraordinary courage, the acts that make headlines, through ongoing, quotidian practices of bravery. Mitzvah goreret mitzvah, and bravery begets bravery. But Ben Azai continued, Aveirah goreret Aveirah. A transgression leads to another transgression. Just as we can strengthen the muscles of bravery, we can strengthen the muscles of cowardice, of turning our heads and pretending we don't see what's in front of us. Ben Azai didn't have the language of moral fading, but when he said Aveirah goreret Aveirah, I think he was describing this very phenomenon. We can avoid confrontation until avoidance becomes a habit. We can feed our anxieties until they outweigh our convictions. There are times for compromise. Sometimes our ego or tribalism has led us into battle. Sometimes we should take a step back and reassess whether our fight is virtuous or self-righteous. Sometimes there are good reasons to meet halfway, to thread the needle. But there are also times for resoluteness. The line between good judgment and cowardice is thin. And sometimes when we fall on the wrong side of that line, we pretend a situation is more complicated than it is because we are squirming from doing the right but costly thing. Adam Serwer writes, everyone always has sound, rational reasons for caving to intimidation. They're protecting their reputation, their job, their family, their institution, their investments. The number of reasons to succumb compound until fighting back can feel like a fool's errand. But in every case, the act of capitulation compromises the very thing those capitulating say they want to protect. When we are afraid, it is tempting to tell ourselves, I'm biding my time. I'm amassing necessary social or professional or economic capital so that when the time comes for me to speak out, I'll be prepared. So we wait for somebody else to be brave, and we justify our own submission as risk aversion or self-preservation. But Aveirah goreret Aveirah, cowardice begets more cowardice. Capitulation breeds more capitulation. Most of us are not elected officials fielding death threats, soldiers in a war, or journalists resisting state censorship. I pray that we will never face stakes as high as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in our own moral conflicts. But all of us will face times when we want to be brave, when we want to make a career change, make a new friend, self-advocate, share an unpopular perspective, fight for a cause, change or leave a relationship, or pick ourselves up off the floor after grief. All of us will experience our values being challenged. Principles we hold dear will be threatened. People we love and people we don't know will need our help. The brokenness of our world will threaten to break our own integrity. All of us will be called to be brave. If we know what we stand for, and if we've been strengthening our muscles of courage, we will be ready. On Yom Kippur, we are at our most vulnerable as we stand before God. We present our brokenness, our failures, our fears, and we ask, "What do you demand of me?" May we have the courage to hear and to fulfill the answer.